Welcome, everyone. Do you hear me properly? Good. Very good. Welcome to this book launch. It's going to be probably a very thoughtful session here. We are going to discuss a long history book, but that sheds a very interesting light on what is going on today in world economic governance, and among that also world trade governance. It is my privilege to discuss this book with the author, Martin Daunton, who is Emeritus Professor of Economic History at Cambridge University, with a very long career, spanning also social history, which is a very interesting way of entering this. Martin Daunton wrote a book that's called The Economic Government of the World, 1933-2023. We'll discuss it later, but basically covers the pre-Bretton Woods, post-Bretton Woods order, how it mutated in the 90s to something more neoliberal, and then its future is in question today. I was very struck by one sentence in page 770. It's a very long book, very detailed, very lively as well, very, very interesting passages there on how things came about. But there's one sentence that struck me, is that the dangers facing the world are greater than at any time since 1945. So against this backdrop, we'll start this conversation. And we have with us Simon Evenet, who probably doesn't need to be introduced to this audience here. Simon is a professor of international trade and economic development at St. Gallen. He is founder of the famous Global Trade Alert database tracking system of trade barriers across the world, and he's also founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. You'll be part of the conversation and comment also on Martin Daunton's book. So, Martin, what is it that motivated you to write this book? Why are you writing it now? And why? What I found interesting about your profile is that precisely you seem to have started your career as a historian in social history, and then you end up with these macro world topics there. Why did that come about?
Well, that's a question I sometimes ask myself. Why did I write such a big book? In fact, I don't think it is at all surprising that I started out in social history and moved into this, financial and trade history. Because working on late 19th century British history, the debate over free trade, imperial preference, which tore apart political parties at that time, is about social history and about trade policy. Because the question was how to pay for welfare reform in a globalized world economy in which some people were suffering. And to some of the conservatives, the answer was to reject free trade, to have imperial preference, to pay for old age pensions by having tariff reform. If you were a liberal,
can you speak closer?
If you were a liberal and you wanted to maintain free trade, you needed to have progressive taxation. So I see the whole issue about trade policy as being linked about welfare policy, about social policy, about how to balance the winners and the losers from a globalized world economy. And of course, that is the issue that we continue to face. So I don't see social history to trade policy as being a continuity. I see it as being a continuity. Okay, but why write this book? And I think there were reasons
Yeah.
why dare I mention Brexit, because obviously the debates are about what should the Britain be within the global world economy. Also, I felt a major turning point as I was writing this book in the configuration of the global economy. So I was looking at the balance between economic nationalism and internationalism over the last century. And I feel we're at a turning point like that at the moment. And the final reason I decided to write the book is that I was annoyed as a historian with the ways in which some politicians and economists were misusing history. Now, that might be a point that will come up later in the conversation about how to add to the debate. But it seems to me that after the financial crisis, a lot of politicians and economists were referring back to the response to the Great Depression and learning wrong lessons from history. And as a historian, rather arrogantly, I wanted to put them right.
Okay, so what are these lessons of history? What's the key message in the end of this book? And what does it add? I mean, there is a lot of literature around already about Bretton Woods and the origins of the trading system and things like that. What is it you wanted to add to this conversation? Yeah.
Yeah, it's always rather presumptuous to write another book when there's a whole library already on. I had to try and justify why to write this and what is distinctive about the book. And I like to think there are four things which are distinctive about the book. One is that a lot of writing deals with trade apart from finance, apart from domestic politics. I wanted to put it all together. So exchange rate policy and what was happening internally within the major economies. That's one thing. But the second point was I wanted to understand why the Bretton Woods institutions took the shape they did, which meant excluding certain things. So my view is that back in the 1930s, here in Geneva at the League, there were a lot of debates over what was called positive security, which meant dealing with food, and this became narrowed down. Why was there a process of narrowing? Third point was about geopolitics. I wanted to relate this to debates over the but also in the 1930s, response to fascism and Nazism, as well as the Cold War. And the final reason was what I was talking about, which is that my view is that international trade policy would only work if there were a domestic social contract to ensure domestic electoral support for policies of open trade. So I think that again was something was distinctive and goes back to what I was saying about my earlier in
Makes absolute sense. Closer to today, then, given that you've looked back and through all this history, what is it that, what's your diagnosis of where we are today? What is it that basically your book tells us that with the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we avoided potentially a Great Depression as the 1930s, but this doesn't mean everything is well. What is it that was broken basically since 2008 and we're still feeling?
okay. Well, there are two parts to that. One is what was broken and what was not mended
Okay.
after what was broken. And I was interested in both of those. So what was broken? Let me go back to what I was saying about Edwardian Britain and the debates there about global trade and domestic welfare. one of the key writers there was John Hobson, who argued that the problem there, which is going to lead to a collapse of globalization, was underconsumption within Britain as the core of the world economy and owned by the rich. And he said that that led to a backlash against globalization at home. People were under consumption because of poverty. Over-saving by the rich led to capital exports, and he said would lead to war. The recent book by Matthew Klein and David Pettis, Trade Wars are Class Wars, continues that argument. So I was picking up on that sort of the key issues that was a problem in 2008 was that problem about growing inequality and how that leads to a backlash. And it seemed to me that that is a major reason for the global financial crisis. It's what Rajan called populist credit expansion. Because of inequality within the United States, in particular, Britain as well, in order to secure continued ability to buy goods, particularly from China, there had to be what he called populist credit expansion. Also, the weakness of a social safety net within the United States, meaning that you had to overstimulate the economy to compensate for the weakness of social safety net, and with the weakly regulated global financial system also being a problem. And I think, again, linking back to my interest in social history, I'd look at what I would call the wealth effect, that in the 1930s, it was possible to regulate banks because there were very few people who benefited from it. Now you have a larger coalition of people who are bought into the system because of credit cards, because of mortgages, because of their private equity plans, private investments. So you have a bigger bailout constituency. So I was looking at the ways in which these tensions were operating within economies. Also looking at China and understanding the way in which in China it's almost an opposite problem of oversaving and then having to have the use of that savings by buying American treasuries, fueling that expansion of the market in America, but also overinvestment, if you will, in infrastructure within China, which could lead to a crisis. So I was looking at those sort of debates over 2008. And in my view, in the view I put forward in the book, understanding why the reaction was as it was is critical.
Okay.
And that's where I make the comparison back to the 1930s, where there was a completely different reaction to how to solve a problem of a financial crisis.
Okay. Can you go a little bit more into that? The differences?
Okay, the danger is if I start talking about this, I'll go on almost as long as the book. So stop me.
I'll stop you. Don't worry.
So I suppose that the argument would be that why is there defeat of a fiscal stimulus within the United States? So you have a fiscal stimulus in China, which they need to have for their own internal domestic reasons, but not within the United States. So why that? Why did the British government pursue austerity against the advice of the IMF?
Yeah,
and of course, this is now what we're getting the problems of in Britain at the moment, with hospitals and schools falling down. So I wanted to know, why is there defeat of the fiscal stimulus? Why in America in the 1930s, mortgage relief to homeowners rather than bailing? Why was there in the 1930s a turn to equality in the United States, but not after the global financial crisis? So a lot of the book is about why those decisions were made in the 1930s by Roosevelt and the New Deal, and not later on by the Obama administration. So I think the decisions which were made after 2008 were justified in the short term, quantitative easing and swap lines. But I don't think the longer term decisions were made that perhaps ought to be made. And this, of course, is where, as a historian, I start to become politically engaged, which is always a dangerous thing for historians because we always say to ourselves we should be neutral and disinterested. But I feel at this point that one ought to be starting to talk about ways in which one should start to take the argument a stage further, perhaps more like Roosevelt in the New Deal. And the question then is going to be, I don't know, Simon might ask me about that, whether or not that is what Biden is now trying to do.
Yeah. Well, okay, we'll go back to that.
Yeah.
So you go into these issues, and then another dimension of this wide-ranging book is that this is also the era where the United States are the hegemon, establish their hegemon in the system and in establishing the rules, in showing leadership after 1945, but building on experiences gained in the 1930s, especially with trade agreements, and how the US continued to shape this world. Where are we? Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And where are we with this US hegemony today, and what kind of consequences do we see if with the decline of the US generally?
Okay, gosh, this big question. So, may I be impertinent?
Please do.
And contradict you?
Okay, good.
I'm a bit wary about this idea about hegemony.
Okay.
Even for the United States, when it was at its peak after 1945. I mean, clearly the United States was the most powerful economy in the world after 1945. Was it hegemonic? That's one of the one of the questions I ask in the book. Let me just reflect on that a moment. It goes back to Charles Kindleberger, who was working here in Geneva at the League of Nations in the 1930s. And in a famous book he wrote after the war, he develops hegemonic stability theory, which I guess everybody knows, which is that the world economy worked before 1914 because Britain was the dominant power and was like the conductor of the orchestra, phrase. In the interwar period, according to one Treasury official in Britain, the problem was there was no hegemon. Britain thought it was, and it was incompetent. America could have been, and it didn't want to be. And they said it was like where somebody was trying to steer the car and didn't have the ability to do it. Somebody who could do it is sitting in the passenger seat with their arms crossed, and the French are in the back seat telling everybody what they ought to do. So the argument then is that after 1945, America was in the driving seat and wanted to drive the system, and that was all fine. Now, that's the view I think you're just putting forward, that it was a hegemon. What comes out, I think, in the book is that although America wanted to be the hegemon, it couldn't be. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. One is that Cordell Hull, the US Secretary of State, and Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, both wanted Britain to give up imperial preference. It stayed. So Britain is weak, it's a supplicant, is accepting loans. It gives imperial preference. It didn't. So how on earth was that able to? Also, the Americans wanted to have a particular vision of trade, which was multilateralism without any controls. They were trying to work on the assumption that the European economy would suddenly recover after the war. They were wrong. And they had to introduce martial aid. Now, it's often said martial aid was, if you like, a of the Bretton Woods Agreement and of multilateralism. No, it wasn't. It was a fundamental change. And perhaps the third way in which America could not be hegemonic relates to where we're sitting now. at the end of the war, the Americans wanted to have an international trade organization. They go to Havana to negotiate it. They wanted to have this particular vision of open multilateral trade. But at Havana, Americans, you have the Indians who are about to get independence. So there, the Americans have to give way to these other powers to get signature on the contract, on the charter. You go back to Washington, and Capitol Hill says, what the hell do you think you were doing there? We're not going to sign up to that deal, which is socialistic and undermining free trade. So I think what the book brings out all the time is the contingencies which limit even America at its peak of its apparent dominance. So I'm trying to look at the, in fact, the messy realpolitik of all of that. Okay. So
that is precisely what I found very fascinating in the book, is how fleeting and fragile sometimes situations are, and how deals come about or don't come about, but it's razor thin.
Yeah.
With internal debates within the U.S. administrations, all these negotiations between the big powers, and so that is indeed quite fascinating.
So I think you were saying that is American dominance now going to be lost? The question there is, how far was it dominant?
Okay.
And what were always those limits, those restraints? So I was talking there about those limits which existed even at the peak of America.
And now today, where is it going?
We're in a situation where America is not so powerful. It's a major economy. So the American ability economy is always constrained. So in a way, it's about how the Americans created what they saw as, if like, Frankenstein's monster, which is the EEC.
Right.
So I'm talking about the Kennedy round in the 1960s, where the American under Nixon, and Kennedy and then under Nixon, say, how do we deal with the fact that the European economy has now become powerful and is undermining our ability to compete? What does one do about that? And then you have people like John Kenneth Galbraith saying, well, we pull our troops out of Europe. That'll teach them. To which the Secretary of State will say, yeah, and you want tanks to roll in from Russia? So all the time there's debate going on within the American administration over exactly what is the point. Is it economic freedom? Is it capital flows? Is it geopolitical security?
Okay. I can confirm that makes for a few fascinating chapters there, for those who are interested in this question. Now, we're sitting at the WTO. We'll talk less about Bretton Woods, finance, etc. We have someone like Adam Tooze who made reviews of this. But Adam Tooze is very focused on finance. So let's talk about trade. We're here in the WTO. Public forum is a place where there's a lot of debate of where things should go in future. So what is your diagnostics, basically, diagnosis of the state of world trade governance, and the state of the institution, and where should the leaders take it? Small question.
Well, historians are very good at having excellent 20% vision by hindsight.
Okay.
They're very bad at having 20/20 vision with foresight. So I'm slightly hesitant about answering your question, but I'm going to answer it anyway.
You have a few paragraphs in the end of your book,
it's pointed out by one reviewer of my book, Harold James, that I spend some time in the book criticizing other people for making predictions. Okay, I'm going to make predictions myself. I'm going to do that. One of the things I pick up in the book is Daniel Dresner's book, which probably some of you know. where he celebrates the WTO and says the WTO managed to save the world from another Great Depression. It worked.
The system worked.
The system worked.
That's how
is the title of the book. It stopped a slide into trade war. It created a rules-based system. Now, he wrote that book, I think, in 2014. Would he be so confident now, I wonder? And I suppose, to some extent, that goes back to what I was saying earlier on about the reaction to 2008. Because I said that a depression was stopped by US quantitative easing and swaps, by Chinese fiscal stimulus. But I was also saying that things were not fixed which ought to have been fixed, like in the 1930s. So no fixing of the gross inequality, no fixing of regulation of the financial sector, no fixing of that disequilibrium between the Chinese and the US economy, which would lead to internal instabilities within the global economy. So I think that Dresner was exaggerating the success of the WTO because he wasn't looking at the wider geopolitical and social economic structures within which the WTO was working. Now, the future of the WTO is obviously a matter of real concern. I read articles in the Financial Times or by Adam Tooze on his Substack, which says that the World Trade Organization is a moribund organization. Well, it doesn't look moribund from where I'm sitting at the moment. Well, you look alive, more or less. The WTO, I think, I argue in the book, was set up, extending GATT, as an attempt to limit American possibility to becoming unilateral. And it has to be understood in that context. There was strong opposition within the United States around the time of Seattle, for example, even before Trump came in. The feeling after that China exploited the terms of entry into the WTO, that the Doha round overreached itself. And I don't think there's much sign that Biden is trying to do very much to revive the WTO. Paul Krugman recently pointed out that American administration was bending the rules of the WTO to suit its own strategic interests. Now, I also think that a story I tell in the book is the way in which, at many critical junctures, the multilateral institutions were sidelined. So when the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate regime collapsed, the IMF was absent. It was other institutions which came in, like the G20 or OECD, various ad hoc bodies. So are we expecting too much from the multilateral institutions like the WTO to fix these problems? So what I'm trying to look at in the book and looking at it in the conclusion is how much should we expect multilateral institutions to do? Should we be thinking about what I think Robert Huss called more messy multilateralism?
Okay.
I was very struck by one review of my book by Harold James, official historian of the IMF, which said that my story is as I'm being like Henry Kissinger. I never thought anybody would ever accuse me of being like Henry Kissinger. But he said what Kissinger and Nixon were doing back in the 1970s was what Kissinger called, let's fuzz it up.
Okay.
Let's
Muddle through.
not go for a policy of attempting to block what would now be China, OPEC at that time. You don't go for all-out trade war. You don't go to the barricades, said Kissinger. you don't behave like Prince Metternich in the 19th, because you're just going to look as if you're a loser, you're antediluvian, you're a backwoodsman, you're a reactionary. You fuzz it up. You try to offer concessions here, concessions there. You do, and you rule. And Harold James says, well, perhaps that is what I'm advising at the end of my book. You fuzz it up rather than try to go for some sort of utopian approach to solving things by creating an all-powerful utopian WTO. And I'm afraid I criticised Pascal Lamy after the global financial crisis, where he said what was needed was to go back to the wider agenda of the abortive International Trade Organization. That was a misreading of history. By trying to have an all-inclusive singing and dancing policy at the ITO, it failed. And what worked was GATT, which was limited. So I'm arguing for a more realistic view. But what I'm also arguing is that I'm not like Henry Kissinger, you'll be pleased to know, in that I think that the only way to create a more, if like, balanced, effective trade system internationally, to be hung up on trade negotiations and rules within these walls, is to fix those problems I was referring to within the domestic economies. There's no point having a powerful multilateral institution if you don't previously fix those problems of underconsumption, oversaving within China, the problems of inequality, weakly regulated financial systems within the United States. The lesson of the book, if there is one, is that the Bretton Woods regime after 1945 only worked because there was a powerful domestic social contract within the societies, the states, which were willing to sign up to it. And I think that is the prior stage that is needed. So my advice to delegates to the WTO is to go back home and argue for domestic social reform to create the basis upon which one can create a fair and equitable trade system.
Okay, so go back to basics basically is the message here. May I tease you out a little bit more on these questions? Two types of questions. I mean, one on this social contract. What strikes me, sitting in Europe and having been in Brexit Britain, I live in France, I'm half German, so how states are, the political systems we have are so broken in many ways that it's very hard to take the right decisions because we already have such constituencies that just make populism one of the obvious ways to go, even for officially non-populist governments. Be it German-style austerity, or in France, all sort of public infrastructure that is not being fixed. I'm not talking about the UK. And how do you do that? It's not the financial market that stops you from there. I mean, we see that with Liz Truss, who had such a radical, I mean, it was even too radical for the financial sector, what she was trying to do. Yeah. So she accused the financial world to be from the left, which, or her government, which was so absurd. So, I mean, please that. And then the other one is, you mentioned briefly, we need to fix the climate crisis with trade. So I also thought, how do you do that? Two big questions.
Yeah. I suppose that in a way it's like going back to the starting point of my book in 1933. The argument of the book starts really with the World Monetary and Economic Conference of 1933. What a terrible time that was, in a sense that Hitler has just come to power. Stalin's embarked on collectivization of agriculture. You've got famines and disaster in Ukraine. It was easy to be pessimistic for very good reasons. But Roosevelt has also come to power at the same time, and he doesn't really know what to do. He doesn't know whether to become economic nationalist to rebuild the economy of the United States at first, or, like Cordell Hull wanted, to go for the international world at first. You need to have people there who had a vision of what to do and how to sell it to the domestic electorate. Now, do we have that now? Is the issue. I think that's at the back of your question, but American politics is deeply dysfunctional. British politics is not far behind it, I think. At least there's a prospect there that there might be a new government in Britain. I suppose this is where I'm sort of admitting my own politics, which is I hope there is a Labour or Lib Dem victory. I'm actually a Lib Dem. For strategic reasons. But what I don't see at the moment is John Maynard Keynes. And it's one thing I'm arguing for in the book. You need to have a vision of how the economy should be working. So one thing I argue for in the book is a need to have a reformed economics. That was what Truss was so wrong about, and Kwasi Kwarteng, who, alas, has a PhD in economic history from the University of Cambridge and ought to know better, which is that the way to get higher productivity growth is to cut taxes. No, what was shown after the Second World War, is the way to get productivity growth is to have a balance between capital and labour. Problem in the 1970s, the crisis there, I think, was a squeeze on profits, leading to a crisis of the economic order. The problem now is a squeeze on wages. And the problem I think we're finding is that the progressive left is not willing to say that as openly as it ought. Whether that would convince the electorate that the solution to problems is not Brexit, but this ability to construct a more balanced social contract, I think is a problem for our political elite at the moment. I'm not quite sure that they're up to it.
Okay, well, we'll see. Good. Back to a topic here where we link the social and the trading system. You mentioned U.S. politics, it's broken, the Biden administration. What stunned U.S. trading partners was the relatively quick turn to industrial policy, subsidies in the U.S., in partly an attempt to rebuild America, build back better infrastructure, etc., to green the economy. But what shocked many trading partners was the very discriminatory provisions in those laws. Also the competition for investment, the way to snatch away business from Europeans, etc., all these kind of things. And East Asians will also know something about that. What is your, do you think the Biden administration is trying to rebuild, to do something like rebuilding a new social contract? And does building a new social contract have to involve creating frictions with allies?
Yeah. Well, thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act, is, of course, a big issue at the moment and could lead to a backlash trade war with China and also with the European Union. There might be an overreaction by the European Union to that. I think that there's a debate going on over exactly what the importance of that Inflation Reduction Act is. Just to some people on the right, I suppose it's another rejection of market logic. It's state interventionism, which is bound to fail, it's bound to be inefficient. On the other hand, I think many people on the progressive left would say it's another triumph of neoliberalism. It's about de-risking investment. It's about private-public partnerships which will help those people. Whichever one of those is right or wrong, it could also provoke trade wars in the European or China. I think my line on this would be it's a very limited policy. In terms
Right.
of the total size, I don't think it's sometimes assumed to be, where you see how long over time it's going to be spread. But I think it's also stressing industrial innovation and investment at a national level rather than thinking about wider global issues about, I don't know, over climate, over global carbon pricing or whatever it would be. And it's also not doing enough about what I said were some of the internal weaknesses within the United States. Biden is not FDR. He's not picking up that challenge of how to create an adequate social safety net within the United States, and he's not really picking up on I was stressing. So I think that it doesn't go far enough to fix some of the underlying problems. It's a partial solution, but only a partial solution.
Okay. Simon, let's bring you in now, finally. So, what do you make of Martin's sort of diagnosis of this post-2008 world we're in? First on what happened on anything you want to comment on, and then specifically on trade policy, do the data you've been looking at on protectionism, trade barriers, subsidies, etc., confirming whatever Martin has been writing about. And whatever else is it in that book that you, with your academic background, surprised you in a way or not? Yeah.
So thank you, Iana, for that. Let me start with the first observation, which I'm in strong agreement that the fate of the world trading system is in many ways a hostage to fortune of factors which are in many other domains. So social, safety nets, some people worry about high levels of inequality. I think it's much more, for me, it's much less about the inequality, much more the fact that we have more and more shares of our populations who are in dire straits, whether it's health, employment. And I always found that the best book on the 1930s for understanding what happened in the United States was written by a Stanford professor, David Kennedy. And the title of the book says it all: Freedom from Fear. Yeah. And I think what we have seen since the 1970s is more and more either deregulation or undermining of public services, so that the people who are less qualified, less skilled, face more and more risk. And at some point, enough is enough. And yet this is where you get the backlash. So and that's the sort of domestic hostage to fortune, which I buy that argument. And I think that plays out differently in lots of different countries, by the way. Then, of course, the other hostage to fortune is the geopolitical context, which is clearly evolved. We had a system where we actually, in many ways, we had a system that is actually narrower than Martin points it out. It's not just that the GATT, a narrow set of public policy disciplines, it covered a narrow membership of the world economy. It didn't in lots of parts of the world, lots of countries which had very different economic systems, and to the extent that they were in as developing countries, we gave them a pass. So in that sense, we had a system which, quote, worked in some very narrow and special circumstances. So I think that's where I would agree on the sort of hostage to fortune point. Then when you come to looking to the future, does suggest that the fate of this organization depends on what a lot of countries do at home, and hence the discussion and all the rest of it. And I would agree with the view that what the Biden administration is doing, perspective of helping the truly disadvantaged in the United States is clearly not enough. But I would also argue that there's no political incentive from either the Republican or the Democratic Party to fix, or the Republican to fix this, because this aggrieved community is a wonderfully mobilizable force in elections. So that's a bit the problem we face. Now, Let's come to the second half of your question, which, Ayana, which is about what happened in the trading system over time. Here maybe I have a different interpretation, which is that when I look at since 2008, which my team has tracked quite extensively, and then compare it to previous crises, one observation I have is that normally each crisis is associated of pervasive discrimination. So in the 1930s, and devalued their currencies, and then we quote fix that with the GATT. Then in the early 1980s, when we had a very sharp recession, governments did not use tariffs, they resorted to voluntary export restraints, which was the vehicle. And so there was this very clear narrative at the time, documented, by the way, very nicely by the GATT Secretariat, of, we're not going to make the mistakes of the 1930s, but but they did channel all the protectionism through, or discrimination through a different vehicle. Then, of course, that gets, quote, fixed in the Uruguay round by banning voluntary export restraints. And then when the 2008 crisis comes along, well, of course, we can't make the mistakes of the 1930s and the 1980s, so what mistakes are we going to make this time? Okay? And so the discriminatory instrument of choice was subsidies from that moment on. And actually, from a business and political economy point of view, that actually makes some sense. So think of it this way. If you're in 2008, it's a financial crisis, remember. Companies need to borrow lots of money to pay their workers and suppliers before they get the revenues from their customers, okay? So this working finance is a key feature of modern capitalism, and that's what dries up. So if you're a firm, you're worried about making your payroll next month. Putting a tariff in place is like the most stupidest thing to do, because because expenditure switching from imports to local buying takes time, and during a crisis, stop spending anyway. So the last thing I expected in 2008 was to see tariffs go up, because that didn't fix what I expected to see was directly from governments, sometimes where it could at least be defended that they were having liquidity problems, and this was the way we got them through it. Okay, so that was, if you're an optimist, that's the hope. The outcome actually was, when you look in the data, huge amounts of subsidies given to firms which were not in banking, which were less than viable. Okay, and so then the subsidy habit in all the major jurisdictions, not just China. Let's be very clear here. It's not just a Chinese phenomenon. And what we had here in this house was a constructed monitoring exercise which looked at whether or not governments were going to repeat the mistakes of the 1930s, which is putting up tariffs. So they looked for the fire which was be created by rising tariffs. And as I said, that was never going to happen anyway. So you ended up with these reports coming out of the Secretariat saying very few trade barriers have been raised. And you cite these a lot, Martin. And I mean, I think if I was to be a bit critical, you should have been less dependent upon the official sources here, because the information flow to this organization about subsidies and that alike was deliberately stopped by many G20 countries. They frustrated it. So the reports couldn't show what action was actually happening. So then what we get as we go through the past decade is more and more governments get used to using subsidies. Okay? And then, irony of ironies, Donald Trump runs for president and says, this WTO is rubbish because it hasn't stopped Korea and Japan using lots of subsidies, and they are cheating. And of course, if you're a faithful multilateralist, you have to say, oh, don't worry about that. We've got an agreement to deal with that. We've got dispute settlement to deal with that. And it's not in any of our monitoring reports, so what's the problem? He has to be wrong. No, on this one issue, Trump was absolutely right. This institution and its members on subsidies a long, long time ago. Now we are paying for this because as governments have got used to this instrument, what they like about subsidies is they can target them to. What firms like about subsidies is that they can get a subsidy and not their right? If a government raises tariffs against all imports, all your rivals get that advantage too. And so I think by missing the subsidy wave and then why firms like subsidies, why governments find them convenient, we have failed to diagnose what the real problem is. Now, I should say, in the last year or so, there's been a lot more attention given to subsidies in this House and also by the other IOs. We will see what progress gets made, but that is one of the big problems here. And even if we fix it here, we still have all the broader contextual questions which you raised earlier.
But the fire has started. I mean, delayed.
Sorry?
The fire on tariff have started.
On tariffs?
Yes. I mean, with Trump, you know.
But it was...
It's clear. And I mean, we have all the... How much... I don't have the exact data, but, you know, I think it's a huge share of U.S. trade has tariffs on China that are absolutely not legal.
Sure. No,
They have not gone. China has retaliated. Sure. They're not gone. The genie is out of the bottle. I mean, obviously we didn't do tariffs in 2008, but given that everything was not fixed, now we have them.
So let's say two things here. So
okay.
First, no other country decided to emulate the United States tariff response against China. Right? Okay, that would have. So it's not like this has spread. And remember, U.S.-China trade is 5% of world trade. I'm sorry, these are two big countries, but 95% of world trade is not covered by this particular insanity which you're describing. So that's one thing. The other thing that we
did
found...
have retaliation?
One thing we found the second point is one thing we found when we looked very carefully about where America had allocated its subsidies before the trade war, lots of it was in the very products imported from the... So they had essentially tried helping their import competing firms through subsidies, first very quietly, different levels of government, not arguing it was coordinated, it just happened. And the scale of that actually as the tariff stuff that comes later. And I think this is this type of finding you can't get unless you forensically collect all this information and aggregate it up. And I'm afraid that doesn't happen in this House. It does happen at the other side of the country, in the university where I'm located.
Okay. Martin, do you want to respond to that? And maybe we'll have time for one or two questions from the audience.
A very quick response to Simon. One is, well, thank you for that comment about subsidies. I'm just about to revise the book for the paperback edition, and I'm sure that point might be included. But also, just to refer back to the 1930s, I think there's a very interesting situation here. Think about the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Which was criticised very widely for being pork barrel politics. Which firm, which state is going to get tariff protection? And I think the big success in the 1934 Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act was to stop that pork barrel politics. I think what you're highlighting is there's another form of pork barrel politics over subsidies. How could that? I think that's a very interesting issue within domestic politics. So I think I'll just say that. But I don't personally think that the Inflation Reduction Act of subsidies to American battery producers or whatever is going to fix the problem of lousy left behind jobs anymore. Was trying to do in revising the Rust Belt.
Clear. Okay, we have a few minutes. There's a microphone available. Does anyone want to ask a question, make a comment? Here, we have Laurent Bartos, also from Cambridge University. Law department.
Yeah, thanks. So my question is, when you look at the connection between countries' domestic policies and the interest in the multilateral system, which is what you've been talking about and you diagnose as one of the causes of what we see today. What's the relevance of the changing proportion of trade to the domestic economy when it comes to a country? So the US, for instance, famously has a smaller proportion of trade to GDP than any other country, I think, than Afghanistan, which might explain its lack of interest in the multilateral trading system. Presumably that's changed over time or could change over time. And other countries are relatively more dependent on trade. So how does that feature in countries' approaches to the system?
Yeah, well, thank you, Professor Bartels. It's always nice to have questions from one's colleagues. He told me he would ask a difficult question. That's not so difficult, Lauren. You need to try harder. I think, obviously, the debate I was talking about in Britain over imperial preference-free trade was so critical because Britain had the highest proportion of its GDP traded of any country, I won't say ever. It was really, really very high. So that really was a critical question about sectors like the Lancashire cotton textile industry, or where I come from, South Wales, which is a major coal exporting country. That really, really mattered in a genuine economic sense about jobs. In America, I think it's where it's a very low proportion of the total GDP. It was more about rhetoric and culture, thought. And going back to the 1930s, I think that's the issue. I mean, Smoot-Hawley didn't really matter that much in terms of the impact it had upon either American or global GDP. But my God, people thought it did. I think that one of the issues there is how it's interpreted, what narrative is created. So I personally would not read a very clear mechanistic line between there is this proportion of GDP traded and that political salience. Sometimes that's true, as in Britain, but very often it's not. It's how politicians create a narrative about what causes the problem. And that varies over time and according to circumstances.
Simon, please.
So in short, the blame game matters, right?
Yeah.
When stuff goes wrong, we have to blame someone. Let's blame foreigners. And that's basically the summary of 21st century globalization and trade politics.
Okay. Anyone else? Here in the front, please, could you introduce yourself and your affiliation?
Pierre Horn, I'm from the UN, based in Bangkok, in Thailand. Very good friend of Simon the last 20 years. I'm happy to see him for a long. Simon and I, we used to work on competition policy. He actually deliberately removed the word competition from when he said dominance. But I want to bring this discussion here. I'm currently working on sustainable finance for the Asia Pacific. My sort of provocative question to Mr. Daunton, I don't know you, so I will tell you Mr. Daunton, is whether the title of your book would be more the political economy government of the world rather than just the economic government of the world. Given what you have said, given what Simon has said, and given what we know is happening currently in the world. The last time that you are putting forward, 1933, 2023, the world has changed dramatically. Asia Pacific is giving you a case for that. I work on sustainable. It's not a question of how much finance you want to bring to the question that we are suffering in the least developed countries in the Asia Pacific, not outside. So that's perhaps a Mr. Dr.
I agree. And the editor at Penguin Books than the one we've got. Only I'd spoken. That's what the book is about. It's about the political economy of the world, of the, and I would say governance of the world. We wanted to, which was like off the book in bookshops. That title is Keynes. what he said in some of his 1942, 43, leading up to Bretton Woods. How do we have the proper economic government of the world? But as you rightly say, I'm talking a lot about the political economy, both within countries, but also between countries. I'm picking up what Simon said about GATT. Of course, that is about a particular political economy of the world. Economy is about the Cold War. It's about GATT as a Cold War bloc, which excludes both less developed countries and state trading countries, which initially the Americans wanted to bring in the state trading companies. They probably didn't want to bring in the third world countries because in some sense it was an imperialistic project. So I spend a lot of time in the book talking about some of the issues you talk, which is who has power in deciding to whom money should be lent. Not just conditionality of the IMF or the World Bank, but also the changing balance between public bodies of international institutions lend. After all, the Bretton Woods regime was about controlling finance. As Henry Morgenthau said, let us get the money makers out of the temple of high finance and give it more to political actors who will act for public interest rather than private interest. And you could say that by the 1970s and 80s, the money changers, to use Morgenthau's phrase, are back in. So how does one understand that balance and who has power? So it's, as you rightly say, it's about political economy. That's what the book's about.
Okay. Is there any other question? If I may, I have a last one. I think we have 1.5 minutes. No, 2 minutes. As you say, it's always difficult to look ahead and to make predictions. But what struck me as well is, in terms of fixing the social contract and even governance, there are issues that don't appear in the book. You talk about in an abstract way about rebalancing the power between capital and finance, etc. For me, that sounds very old-fashioned, if you know what I mean. We are in a world digital. We're in a world where everyone, or many people, are both capitalists and precarious workers. I've been like that. I'm an individual entrepreneur. I was exploiting myself, but now I'm doing well. I have skills. I have another type of capital, intellectual. So I wonder at times, is this the right agenda, or how do we think about, in this world of aging societies on the one hand, mass migration coming from younger societies with a lot of pressures from climate change from elsewhere, how do you create this new social contract on terms that are more maybe contemporary, more attuned to the sort of new digital world where the world is moving to Asia, to the developing countries, Africa, etc., etc. It's more of a question because, I mean, you've done, this is a magisterial piece of work you've done. You're a historian, you're not, but that's a little bit, in the conclusion part, I didn't see demographics and I didn't see digital, so I was a bit surprised about that, if you don't mind.
Okay. Well, it's a long book, and you want to make it even longer. But of course, you're absolutely right. I think that I start to pick up, not as much as you would like, and perhaps I should have done, over the sort of argument that's made by the book Capital Without Capital, which is that people like us who've got multiple degrees from prestigious universities, for us a flexible labour market is fine. We can benefit. I think the political economy thing which has changed is that from when I was a young person, I was born in 1949, people who didn't have formal skills, who worked in Ford Motor Company or steelworks or a coal mine, they learnt their skill on the job. They could get a secure job without having formal education. they had powerful institutions of trade unions or various sort of welfare bodies which they set up themselves. That's all gone. And how does one create that sort of new form of association for those people who have what I call in the book lousy jobs, rather than the sort of jobs that we have? And I think that's what some economists, like I quoted Rajan's book, Fault Lines, is talking about, and Paul Collier. How do you try to create what Rajan calls inclusive localism? How do you try to make sure that you rebuild Paul Collier came from, Sheffield, or Pittsburgh, or wherever it might be? I think that's one of the challenges, which perhaps I should have focused more upon, rather than just talking about inequality. As Simon said, it's more about people having poor life chances, of poor health, poor prospects, not just within the developed world, but within the world. That's a challenge as a citizen rather than as a historian should be addressing.
Okay. I think we can leave it at that, because that leaves us with things to ponder. Thank you very much. That was a conversation. I hope it will incite people to read this book. It is very fascinating, I must say. I have an undergrad degree in history, so I'm also attuned a lot to to these conversations. So yeah, thank you very much. It was a privilege to get to know you as well. Simon, good to have this conversation too. And yeah, good to see you around. Thank you.